Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Tristan, and this is Jacob, and we're gonna be doing our lit cast on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. To start, we're gonna give our thoughts on the book, and then we'll go from there. So personally, my thoughts on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Um, Usually when it's these types of books, it's really tiring to read and boring, to be honest. So I was having trouble paying attention to the book just because I found it so boring. I think it's hard for these types of books to really, grab my attention and make me interested. Just when it relates back to history, it just gets kind of boring for me. And I'm more into fiction type books, so that's why I think I didn't enjoy it as much. But I can understand why some people might say, oh, it's one of the most popular books or most important books that America, or that's what America thinks. It's one of the most needed or popular books. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the book, Jeeves?
I have like the opposite thoughts of you. I actually quite like history, so I found it interesting for like a person who was a slave to give an account of his life and how he was treated.
Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from with that. I see the appeal. It's just you know
Yeah.
not for me. Um, Now let's talk about the N-word and the history behind it. So the N-word is used a lot in this book, and we watched a video in class talking about how some people wanted it taken out, or some people wanted it kept in. Um, I think it should be kept in the book because the N word being in the book, it shows the history behind the word, I think. And when you see that word in the book and you read it in your head, it gives it more power. So if it said slave in the book, I think it just would not be as powerful as when like you see that word in the book because the N word has so much history tied behind it, and yeah, it teaches you why it's such a racist term and
Yeah, I
why.
definitely agree on that.
Yes, so in the video, I think it talked there's a black man talking about how he taught the book and he would make the kids say the N word in the books, and he said get over it. And I think as long as you're not using the N word in racist terms and you're talking about it, but you're not using it with malicious or racist intent, I think it's fine. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
also think it builds up and it shows the history of how the word was used back then.
Yeah. Okay, so we agree on that.
Mhm.
Um, so now we're gonna talk about slave life. Um, Slave life was rough, obviously. We're gonna relate this to Frederick Douglass. So everyone knows that slaves were, you know, badly mistreated, and Frederick Douglass talks about this um, in the narrative of his life. So slave life, he slaves constantly had to do work for their owners, and sometimes they'd be sold or bought. Um, I don't know much about this topic, so I'll let you take it away, Jubes.
I, I think an important part is that uh, when Frederick Douglass gives the example of Mr. Gore and how he didn't let his slaves talk back to him, so if they were blamed for something, then they would, even if they were innocent and they prove themselves to be innocent, they would still uh be punished for it because it would show that they they're right and the other person's wrong.
Yeah, so slaves basically were like treated almost like less than humans, and it was just because of their skin color. And now looking back at it, it's just like you realize how stupid it is, like just how dumb it is to like just think if you just think about it for a second, like someone is treated less than a human just because their skin color is different.
Yeah,
So
it's terrible.
Yeah, it's really just doesn't make sense when you look back on it. And you don't like understand why people acted the way they did, but that's just the way it is. Um, and that leads us into talking about how slaves were treated as well. So, yep, like we just said, slaves were badly mistreated, and if they tried to do anything besides what they were told, basically, they could pretty much be beaten, or sometimes they weren't supposed to be, but they would even be they had even been killed by their masters. So if they disobey or do anything they're not supposed to, they were whipped, beaten, tortured until basically they were like bleeding or even like given scars, which is very harsh. So they were, yeah, like I just said, they were badly mistreated.
And also they were not allowed to have like any knowledge, like they weren't allowed to learn to read or write. They couldn't know their birthday.
Yeah, they weren't
Like
like allowed basic human rights, pretty much.
yeah, when Frederick Douglass's mistress was like trying to teach him how to read and write, his master was like, "Stop that! You can't do that."
So yeah, they were badly mistreated, and they were even treated worse when they tried to escape, because many slaves did try to escape. So if you're caught, um, you would get in big trouble for that, and that's what we're talking about next. Slaves that tried to escape. Slaves would try to escape in a bunch of different ways. Um, Most people didn't, or a lot of slaves didn't try to because they thought it was too risky. They feared getting caught. Um, you'd probably get beaten horribly by your owner or master if you're caught trying to escape. Um, I don't know where they tried to escape. Jeeves, do you know where they tried to escape?
They try to escape to the north, but that was like really hard to do since that's like so far away, and the only transportation they had was walking.
Yeah,
And
so
they also couldn't even be seen in public because they would get captured again or even be killed.
so in the public they'd be, if they were seen, they'd be questioned. So yeah, they really had no way of transportation, so they had to walk. And walking that long of a ways is really exhausting, and they need they need like food and water if they're going that long. So it's just a long and difficult process.
And we can even connect this to Huckleberry Finn when Jim says to Huck that he can escape if he has a white man with him.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So if you have a if a slave was with a white man, it's more justified for where he is, because the slaves always have to do what their owners are saying. They always have to comply with their owners who are white, obviously. And yeah, so we're gonna be talking about why they were treated differently now. Um, well, they were treated differently, obviously, because of their skin color. We talked about earlier how this is just like when you think about it now, it's just the most stupid thing ever. And it just doesn't really make sense. Um,
In my A push class, we watched a documentary about this. There was like basically this one book called Types of Mankind that got really popular, and it was basically saying how like a bunch of different races were like actually different, and like how they were like what's the word, like inferior to like white people.
yeah, so they were treated differently because of their skin color, and yeah, I still don't understand like why this was the way it was. Um, and a lot of people don't, but even now, there are racists that think slavery should be brought back, just because they think people with black colored skin act differently and they should be treated differently. So yeah, now we're gonna be talking about religion. I know Jacob, you wanted to start with this one. 'Cause, I know you want to
Oh
say
yeah.
something about it.
So basically, throughout the book, Frederick Douglass kind of bashes Christianity and says like the slave owners use this to like justify their slavery, and they actually pulled quotes from the Bible,
Oh yeah, I remember
or
that.
like
So
yeah,
yeah,
or
so
like that.
they tried to justify racism with from quotes in the Bible, but not everything in the Bible obviously should be taken literally. So people later realized that it
But
was.
as well as the end of the book, uh, in the appendix, he kind of clears up his bashing of slavery, and he says, "Yeah, Christianity's kind of cool, but like the way they were using it is wrong."
Yeah, no, I remember also at one point in the book I think he was talking to God. He was saying, "Oh, why do I have to go through this? Why do I have to be a slave? Why can't I be free? This doesn't make sense." You kind of just had sort of I don't know what if breakdown's the word, but yeah, he was talking to God,
Hmm.
and obviously he did believe in God, I think, and he was just like kind of asking him, why do I have to go through this? So, um, now I wanted to pull a quote that shows how Frederick Douglass learned how to read and write, which is actually he was really clever about it, or not really clever, but it was just a smart way of learning how to read and write because Frederick Douglass wanted to learn how to read and write. So this quote says, taken from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, it says, "The plan which I adopted and the one by which I was most successful was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers." So basically, what he's saying here is he would take um, white kids' homework, or he'd bribe them or convince them to hand over their homework from school, and he like made friends with them. So he'd take their homework, and their homework would be teaching them how to read and write. So he'd use that to his advantage, and he'd teach himself how to read and write. And he did in doing this, he learned the alphabet and all that different sort of thing. So he kept doing that, and as he got more practice, eventually he learned how to read and write properly, and this gave him more knowledge, and it gave him a sort of advantage over his slave owners.
Oh yeah, and the quote that I chose actually kind of connects with that one. It is from the narrative life of Frederick Douglass. If you give Nword an inch, he will take an L. An Nword should know nothing but to obey his master. This was when his master found out that his mistress was teaching him how to read and write. And so he stopped that, and he, because of that, he had to take the homework from these little white boys so he could learn how to read and write with no help from his mistress.
Okay, so after going over those two quotes, I know, Jubes, you wanted to relate the life of Frederick Douglass to a book.
Okay, so back to the book I mentioned, Types of Mankind. This was based off the idea of scientific racism, basically the idea that there is scientific proof that other races are inferior to others. This was very popular during the antebellum period and was used to basically keep slavery how it was, and also for the political reasons because the North was a abolitionist and did not want slavery. So this was kind of a way to like counter that and actually say, yes, these people are inferior. So more specifically about the book, um, it basically went through like different races like Egyptian, white people, black people, and like had different names for them, and basically showed some differences. Some of the data was true, but it was mostly misinterpreted, but there was a lot of false data, and basically they just used this to say that slavery was inferior, basically.
All right. So now I'm gonna talk about a quote. Uh, and this quote talks about from the book, and this quote talks about how one of Frederick Douglass's slave owners actually treated him like a human being, and this was because she didn't know how slaves were supposed to be treated. But then after the realization, she started to treat him just like any other slave owner did. So here's the quote. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. So, like Frederick said, once the slave owner realized the power she had, she sort of became, I guess you could say, corrupt. So I think this says that power, if someone's giving power, um, it can lead to them being corrupt in some way. Because,
Um, uh,
yeah, you can go ahead.
okay. I also think that one of the reasons that she didn't really know how like she should treat slaves is because she lived in the city, and slaves weren't usually given as harsh as punishments as they would in like other places such as a plantation that wasn't in public, so they could like give out more harsh punishments without having any repercussions.
Yeah, I agree. So, like I just said, yeah, once she realized the power she had, she basically turned from like this angelic, super nice person to like a demon. Um, Next, I also wanted to talk about um how there was one of Frederick Douglass's slave owners, I think. Um, he was he went by the name of Edward Coby. He was Coby was beating Frederick senseless pretty much. But as this was happening, Frederick's mental was so broken to the point where he was thinking to himself, "Well, I should just rebel and fight back because I have nothing left to lose." And when he finally decides to fight back, he realizes he's stronger than Covey and he can actually beat him in this fight. So he beats him in the fight, and I think that gives Frederick a sense of confidence, and it also gives Covey a large sense of fear that he could rebel at any time again, and he can fight back at any time.
In addition to that, Mr. Covey could have taken him to a public whipping post, but because Mr. Covey was like seen as this like slave breaker who could like just beat slaves and like just control them. So if he did take Frederick to the whipping post, he would lose this like popularity he had for being like a slave breaker.
Um, yeah. So the last thing I want to talk about is one more quote. Um, this is a sort of a longer quote, but it's Frederick talking about how when he was escaping, he had to leave behind friends he had, and how that was a difficult experience for him to go through. So the quote says, "It is impossible for me to describe my feelings as the time of my contemplated start drew near. I had a number of warm-hearted friends in Baltimore, friends that I loved almost as I did my life, and the thought of being separated from them forever was painful beyond expression. It is my opinion that thousands would escape from slavery, who now remain, but for now the strong cords of affection that bind them to their friends, the thought of leaving my friends was decidedly the most painful thought with which I had to contend." So, Frederick thinks that one of the hardest things about becoming free is the fact that he had to leave a bunch of friends behind. And at one point, like similar to having to leave his friends behind at one point. He had to leave his family to go to Baltimore, but this wasn't the same in his eyes because he barely even knew his family, so the separation was not that difficult for him. But he says leaving his friends is one of the scariest things he had to do. And he also talks about how he thinks a lot more slaves would try to escape if it didn't mean like leaving people they love behind.
Yeah, I can relate to that, so I agree.
That's all we have to talk about pretty much for this litcast.
Yep,
Thank you for watching and listening to me and Jacob talk. That's it.
thank you.